Washington got some exciting commits in football and basketball.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back in to another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hansen. He's the site editor with Inside the Huskies at Athlon Sports. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. Terms and conditions apply. So, Lars, as we said, the transfer portal was very good to the Huskies over the weekend as Washington received one recruit on the football side and two transfers on the basketball side of things. We're going to start off on the football side, and that's defensive lineman Deshawn Lynch. We were just having a very fun conversation about him before the show started, and we said, all right, let's stop and let's hit record. So I'm just going to let you pick up and just tell us a little bit about Deshawn Lynch and some of your thoughts.
So he's a really interesting addition because when we talked about what does Washington need along that defensive line, we did think interior, and then you go look at his PFF page, and it's aside from 6 snaps, it's the rest are at outside edge. And when you look at the tape, you do see, okay, he does play edge, or he did play edge at Sacramento State. But when you look at his size at, I believe, 6'5", 281, 283, somewhere in that ballpark. So he's a guy that doesn't necessarily scream, okay, he's almost a perfect tweener size. And peel back the curtain fully. You mentioned Voight and Newfie. The one that comes to mind for me in a way is Levi Onwuzurike, where it's not, to your point, you mentioned he's not as explosive as he is, but they do have similar comps to where if you need to kick him outside, you can. But this is really going to be more of that Voight and Newfie mold where you take somebody who's slightly undersized, but who has maybe an ideal for him to be an interior pass rusher. Just to me, he doesn't have a ton of experience at that, at least last season. So to me, it's an interesting addition to see. Do they truly see him as an edge where you mentioned again, Jacob Blaine as a now redshirt freshman looked pretty good this spring. Does that stun his sophomore? Does that stun his growth in any way, or do they make him go full outside? Do they put Deshawn Lynch on the inside? I do think from the flexibility perspective, it's a great addition.
Absolutely. So this is my thought, where the more I think about the Jacob Lane side of things, the more I like this addition, where we saw Lane do some nice things. We saw him do some nice last season. We saw him do some nice things in spring ball as well. But the one thing that really gets me with this addition is the flexibility that you're talking about there, where you can have him be a true run setting edge, or just, I'm going to set the edge hard against the run, which is really nice because of the bodies that are in the room. You don't really have that, where I know Zach Durfee could do it. I'd like to see Maurice Himes take a step forward in that department this season. But when you look at the rest of the guys in the room, it's a bunch of big, long dudes who are really good at getting after the passer. Where, you think about Lance Holtzclaw, Isaiah Ward, Jaden Wayne's in this mix now, Russell Davis, where all those guys specialize as pass rushers. And you don't have anybody in that mix who's really going to be, that bigger just guy that's going to play the run a lot harder, where I'm not saying any of those guys are bad against the run, but they're not just somebody who that's going to be their primary job. Where a guy I think of in that mold who's really good at getting after the passer as well is Jeremiah Martin in that same vein, where it's somebody who is really good at setting the edge and just doing that job as well, where that's something that I think Deshawn Lynch could do against the run, and then take the lane role, especially on the inside against, just when it's 3rd and 7, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9, he's going to be really situational in some of those roles. And instead of a Jacob Lane, instead of kicking Zach Durfee to the inside, you have him in there where he's bigger. He's a little bit longer than some of those other guys, and he can do a little bit more things because you comped him to Levi Onwuzurike. I see where you're going with that. I like the comp. I don't think he necessarily has that same elite first step that Levi showed for so long over his time here, but I certainly like that. And I think this is just a fun addition where, you can continue to bring along a guy like a Bryce Butler and a Linnaeus Davis, some of these other younger defensive tackles in the room. Omar Khan is a name we haven't mentioned much because he wasn't up here for spring ball, but that's another guy who I think is going to be a really good run defender, especially early on in his career. But this kind of gives Lynch's addition gives them some more time to develop as pass rushers, while not necessarily saying, all right, we need these guys to contribute right away, because that's something he might be able to do.
Yeah, and one thing that's interesting, the more we start to unpack who Deshawn Lynch is, what his game is also like, you have to go back to when he came out of high school in 2020 at Folsom. At one time, he was a
Yeah.
4-star recruit, and that tells me there's enough potential that's what Washington State. It's what Washington is leaning into. Slight Freudian up there, but that's what Washington is leaning into with this addition because we're talking about a guy from Sacramento State that didn't just spend one season; he spent 3 seasons there. Really, more so came on as a junior last season, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
But still playing that edge, still playing on the outside primarily. But when you start to evaluate what he could become, you have to look back. What was he? And there are times at Folsom you can see him line up in both on the inside and on the outside. And that size that you mentioned at 283, he's not like, wow, he's 250, 240. He's not the edge lean rusher, but he's also not,
Exactly.
300 plus where, okay, that's a guy where you're just going to park him right there and he's a little oversized, but he's a great guy to set the run. Having the ability to do both, I think, is what really seems to be this, not the hallmark, but just kind of one of the tenets that Steve Belichick, Jason Kafusi have along this defensive line, where you see Zach Derby obviously is going to be the primary pass rusher, but then you see Lance Holtzclaw, you have Jacob Blaine, and the more you go down that list of Russell Davis, Isaiah Ward, all these guys are slightly different, and Deshawn Lynch fits that mold exactly. Where you look at this roster, and aside from Voy, and even Voy, that's not a like for like comparison, but okay, you're getting warmer in that body type. There's nobody else like him, and you mentioned that. So that's why this isn't, when you pair him with the other addition that they had at edge, which is Jaden Wayne, that's more of a true edge. Now, granted, he's younger, so you're not expecting him to make as much of an impact in 2024, but you're seeing how they are identifying body types to fit multiple things along this defense, which really is just kind of setting this defense up to be really intriguing in 2024.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that I'm most looking forward to is just what the scheme is going to look like, because that's why I like this take a lot, where, if they go with a 3-down lineman sort of look, which is something that Steve Belichick certainly liked during his time in New England, then he can play that, that 4, that 5 technique, something a little bit further outside. And you don't need to use them in just a wide 9 alignment or something like that, because that's something that you have Lance Holtzclaw, you have Isaiah Ward, you have Jaden Wayne, you have those guys 4, and you have Zach Durfee on the other side of the field, where there are so many different ways that this could work. And he brings flexibility. He brings athleticism. I think he's a talented player. I'm really intrigued by this. And this is one of those guys who, you said he's been there for 3 years, is actually going to be a 5th-year junior this year, between redshirting in 2020 and then 2021 as well. So he's got 2 years of eligibility remaining. We're going to see how that plays out. But the more I look at this, the more I'm intrigued. Where, sure, it's not going to be a top flight acquisition like a Jermaine Lole would have been, or some of these other guys, but this is a guy that fits the scheme really well. And there's a lot of different things that he can do in this defense. If you get him moving and just some kind of a stunt or a twist or anything else like that, there are a lot of ways to get him moving and just make sure that he's part of the pass rush in just inventive ways, which is fun. And it speaks to exactly his strengths on the interior. But I'm curious to see how it plays out, and we can't really, put just any kind of mark on that until we get to fall camp. But I really am intrigued. Lars, speaking of intriguing, 2 more basketball commits came in over the weekend as well. And we'll get there right after a message from our friends over at LinkedIn, because when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role in any given month. Over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. You can hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. And that's why 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockdowncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockdowncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Lars, like I said, 2 basketball commits came in over the weekend as well. First, We saw Rhode Island guard Louise Courtwright come through the door, and then later the day, Tyler Harris, a freshman from Portland, and I think he was kind of a hidden gem down there. I think Portland had a star, and it's nice that he made that jump. But Courtwright committed first; he committed in the morning. So let's start there.
Yeah, these are both what the intriguing part about this is, again, similar to our last discussion. When you go look at their player page at their previous school, it lists Louis Courtwright and Harris's guard. One of them is an actual true guard. One of them is not. Louis Courtwright is that guy. When you look at his game, I was able to watch some highlights over the past couple of seasons. Comfortable ball handler. To me, seems like a guy that would be a safe bet to be your point guard. But then you look at the other roster additions, DJ Jamison Butler might have something to say about that. Zoom Diallo certainly can handle the ball at the point, but being a freshman, you don't necessarily want to rush that. So when you get a veteran like Louis Courtwright, who also came from Quinnipiac the previous couple of seasons, he's got veteran experience. He's been around the game. And the one thing he's consistently done, distribute the ball and score in the mid-range game consistently. He does have some outside shooting as well, but this really seems like a floor general that can understand what Sprinkle wants to do in his offense, how to set things up, and he's been around the block. But he can also bring some of those younger guys along in that same breath, so this isn't just a plug and play, and we'll try and worry about the freshman hitter, because I feel like the freshmen are going to play, but this now gives you a solid veteran experience backward to pair with DJ Davis and a couple of the other transfers that they brought in.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one thing you didn't mention there in Courtwright is, so he led Rhode Island in assists last year, but he also led them in steals. So this is a guy who can make an impact at both ends of the floor. I really like what he brings to the table. As you said, is certainly somebody who can step in and score in the mid-range when you need to. But I'm not sure who's going to start here, because I certainly would want to lean on the veteran experience of Courtwright. But if Zoom can come in and show that he is that high-level passer right away and just do the things that you want of him on both ends of the floor, he picks up the offense really quickly. That's not a guy you want to discount either, but I really like the way this backcourt is shaped out. Now, we're getting down to brass tacks here. There's only one scholarship left. We know it should be going to Great Osabor should he decide to commit. It sounds like he's still deciding between Washington, Louisville, and Texas Tech, and that might be it. Tech might be out. We'll monitor that situation as the week goes along. But the more that I look at this backcourt, I think it's really, really intriguing. There's some veteran guys there, and then you add in Jace Butler and Zoom Diallo, like you said. That's really, really talented. I like that a lot. And then that kind of brings us to Harris, because I'm a little bit more intrigued by him, and I don't mean that as any sort of slight at Louis Courtwright, but I just think this dude has a really, really high ceiling, or it's something where you look at him, he shot really well from three-point range at Portland last season, and he was somebody who as I was doing a little bit of research into him, he didn't shoot the three ball before he got there. And he said, yeah, I started putting up 500 shots a day, and he started shooting, 35, 36%, something like that last season. And that's something where if he can continue to develop that part of his game, he's a really good defender. He was an all WCC freshman. And that's something where he's probably going to take a step back this year in terms of playing time, where he played in 22 games last season, started 21 of them, missed some time with an ankle injury. But this is a dude where the more I look at him, the more I say, oh, this could be a guy that comes off the bench and, halfway through the season, Big Ten basketball media is, hey, look at this guy. This guy up at Washington, he's a really exciting piece off the bench.
And to your point, in 2 or 3 years, you could be putting him as a Dominic Green type, that sharp shooting corner three guy that is making maybe in the sense of with the 3-point game, because that was one thing Dominic Green could do. Now again, more so as a sixth man, I would expect Harris probably in a year or two is starting. But your point is valid in the sense of that you want to get those guys in. So if you want to give Zoom or Jace, or you can kind of rotate those younger guys around, so one isn't overwhelmed with minutes, and you're honestly playing the hot hand too. And that's one thing that Harris showed, is he can get hot at times. Again, obviously you mentioned didn't play a full season, so that you kind of got to make sure you can come back from that. But this is another depth piece, and that's all you want to do. Where we talked so much last season when you looked at the bench, it was, okay, he might be able to do one thing. He can kind of do half of two things. Everybody that you look at this bench, they have at least one or two roles. Where now this also gets, again, who's on your bench and who's starting. That's also another good problem to have. And while you might say the flip side of that is, well, no, I'd rather have 5 experienced guys coming in. Well, you had that last season, an experienced guard in Xavier Wheeler, experienced guard in Paul Mulcahy, Keon Brooks, and you go down the list, and Moses Wood, another former Portland guy, ends up coming up and necessarily doesn't have the consistency that we thought he might have. That's one thing for Harris. Coming in younger, has multiple years to develop and sprinkle system. I think by year 2 and 3 will really be hitting his strides as a starter. And to your point, when you look at when they're in the Big Ten in a couple of years from now, or more established in the Big Ten a couple of years from now, this is going to be one of those guys that are pointing to saying, hey, it was an intriguing addition then. Now we've been able to see why they wanted him so early on. And this is one guy you don't want to leave in the portal because, he's from Portland. But the second he goes and has success somewhere else, now you're thinking, okay, now you're going to either, some of these other big major programs, and Washington misses out on the guy that they could have just taken as a sophomore and let him develop over the next 2 years.
And I think that's one of the most intriguing parts of this, and why I'm so high on what it could be, because we've seen Danny Sprinkle, and I mean it's a very different comparison in terms of play style, in terms of him and Great Osibor, and this is certainly not a comparison in any way, shape, or form, but it's something where we've seen what Danny Sprinkle can do with somebody who has a high ceiling like that, and just finds a way to get him involved in the offense and just scheme up ways to make him efficient, to make him do whatever it is he needs to be at his best. And that's one of the reasons I'm so intrigued by this, because he's somebody where I wouldn't expect him to start this year with some of the veteran experience that the Huskies are bringing in from the transfer portal, some of the guys they have already. But when I look at it going into 2025, 2026, this is a guy who, after a year on the bench, after a year, maybe he is just one of those big time contributors, as an honorable mention, all Big Ten. And again, these are really high expectations. And again, by no means is this what I'm saying is going to happen, but he just has that sort of ceiling the more that you watch him. He averaged almost 13-7 last season as a true freshman. And again, it's a lower level of competition, but he's a dude with that ceiling, with that talent. And if you let him sit, you let him develop, you let him put on some weight and continue to develop on the defensive end as well, all of a sudden in 2025, you're looking at a guy who can certainly be a key part of the rotation. And I say this as the more I look at the roster, there are a lot of established pieces. When you think about Frank Kepnang, you think about DJ Davis, you think about Makai Mason. These are guys who we already know what they are. And Luis Courtwright as well, in the same light. We already know what they are because we've seen it. We've seen it enough. Wilhelm Breitenbach is another guy that I just want to throw in that mix, because he's certainly going to have some sort of role in this offense. But we've seen what all these guys are and what they're probably going to be. Is it going to be utilized differently? Yeah, absolutely. But we know what they are. We know what they can be. Tyler Harris, we're not sure what his ceiling is yet. And he looks like, with his frame, with his body type, that he could have one of those super high ceilings.
And it's one thing to remember that this is Danny Sprinkle's first time assembling a roster at Washington. He's building it for the short and long term. This is something where you can't just bring in a bunch of grad transfers or upperclassmen, because not to be fair, at Utah State last season, he did work with a roster that didn't play a single minute, as everyone's well documented that. Doing a similar situation at Washington, granted, he'll have Wilhelm Breitenbach, Frank Kepnang, and a couple other pieces that he's worked with, but still building that program, you want to be able to see that projectability where, okay, whatever Harris's role ends up being this season, whether it's, at the high end honorable mention in the Big Ten, or just being a rotational piece, but you can see the development, you can see the idea, so that after, the 24-25 season, he comes in as a junior, and now you see, okay, this 24 builds onto his junior year, and that's what you want to see for Sprinkle, because over the past 3, 4, 5 seasons at Washington, it was always, how can we band-aid this roster to make it to next season? Now you can clearly see that Danny Sprinkle has a plan, knows what he needs to do next year, right? Knows what he needs to do to make sure it's a competitive roster, because Danny Sprinkle's not a guy that's just going to come in and win 10, 15 games and say, oh, it's a first year, it's a rebuild. It's like, no, I know I have the resources at Washington to be good. I'm still going to measure my expectations, say, hey, this is still going to be a building year, and by year 2 and 3, we'll hit our stride. But that's just even more incredible to see what that stride is going to look like, knowing the potential of this year's roster.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, like I said, this is something we're going to dive way more in depth on later in the week. But if you add Great Osibor to this roster, this all of a sudden, this turns into one of the better teams in the Big Ten, in my opinion. There's so much experience. We know what Danny Sprinkle's offense looks like. We know it can just function at such a high level. And you add a guy like that, who's going to be one of the better scorers in whatever conference it is he ends up in. That's huge right there.
Yeah, and that's the thing is Great Osterborn, no matter what, is a great addition to any of the 3 schools he ends up at. So this is by no means saying what, and I think that's why we're kind of diving through the roster as we did is with Great Osterborn, obviously this becomes one of the top 4 or 5 teams in the Big Ten next season. But even without him, this is still not a bad roster that you comprise. And then you just put that last piece in that says, okay, this is our glue guy that makes it all go. But even without him, we still have ways to make it work, both short and long term. So I think that's worth acknowledging that this isn't just holding out hope and moneyballing it to save up for Great Osterborn. This is we're getting all the right pieces around him. We're doing it correctly so that when if Great decides to be the final piece to our roster, we're not trying to scramble and sprinkle around him. We already know what the team is going to be like with or without him.
I just have to say really fast before I move on. The fact that you peppered in the usage of both the words great and sprinkle, very impressed. High marks to you. But we're going to table just that whole discussion for a little bit later in the week because we got to give a shout out to our guy, Michael Penix. Right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL. And FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockdown and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. And got to give it a shout out because I would still love to see a Timberwolves Celtics matchup in the finals. I know it's 2-2 in that series right now after Minnesota started so hot, but I still have some faith in them. I think we can see that. Lars, rookie minicamp is always just one of my personal favorite times of the year because it's overreaction season. And I mean this in the nicest possible way to Michael Penix. We saw him on social media make 2 or 3 throws that you and I have seen watching practice for the last 2 years. And now it just feels like the grander NFL world is starting to take notice of that. And there are already some people being like, oh, hold on a second. This isn't, what we kind of expected because it feels like he was just given such a certain just slant throughout draft coverage the entire offseason where it was, he had Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan and he did X, Y, and Z and his offensive line was really good. And there's this and there was that. No, he was such a huge part of all of this. And we saw the one throw that the Falcons tweeted out of him just dropping it in sevens over the linebacker. And all of a sudden just Twitter explodes. That's, Kirk Cousins might be shaking in his boots. And it's funny and it's an overreaction, but it's still fun to talk about because it's just fun to watch this from the Washington media side of things, where we've been watching this, we've been saying this, and I know a lot of our colleagues feel the same. And now just seeing it being portrayed on a national stage is so cool for Mike, especially with everything he's been through.
You hit the nail on the head right at the end. I was watching his press conference and in my head, to be fair, I watch it just naturally as a reporter in my head. I'm watching and listening to the questions and how they're asked. And I'm like, okay, that's a good question. Good. Because we know most of the answers that they're asking him. Hey, what was it like going through that? How did you handle this and that? But the one thing that I did take away from all of it, Mike feels perfectly at home in Atlanta. And I think that's something to consider when you think about the situation that he's brought into. He was asked, I want to say, conservatively half a dozen times, maybe a little bit less, maybe 4 or 5, but I'm just going to say 6 for the time being. Times about how are you going to manage the relationship with Kirk Cousins? How are you going to do this? And we both know Mike couldn't care less in terms of, look, we're both quarterbacks. He's been a vet. If you peel back like what does Mike say versus what's cooking on in the head, the Key and Peele, the Obama anger translator, if you will, where in his head he's like, well, we're both quarterbacks. He's a veteran, so I'm coming in. I'm going to learn from him. He's a pretty good quarterback. Yeah, they gave him money, but here's the thing. Whether he plays or not, he's getting guaranteed $100 million, so I don't truly think he cares no matter what him or his agent say. And if I'm good enough, I'll play. They're both great guys. Like, that's the thing. Is it's not I'm not getting the reps. They told me I was going to – Mike's never going to ruffle feathers in terms of he could not play for 2 years, and he'll just be like, yeah, when he does start that third year and lights it up and goes 13-3, he's going to be like, yeah, see, this is what they were just doing in practice. It's like that's what I was doing in 2 years of Washington, just cooking everybody we played. So somebody brought up the Michigan State game, which made me reminisce about Mike. Just I was going into that game thinking, I'm like, whether you're a fan of Washington or not, this is about to be an absolute just torch job right now in 3 hours.
Yeah.
And we ended up breaking Big Ten media policy and getting to go down on the field like 5 minutes before the game was over because they were like, yeah, I mean, nobody's really here. I don't think anybody's going to care at this point. Like, you guys just do your thing. And it's like, yeah, Washington just did their thing. Mike just did his thing in his 2 years at Washington. It's exactly what he's doing in Atlanta. He's that consummate professional. He's been through the ringer. He's grateful for the opportunity. He said all those things. But then when he has that smile and you can just kind of see, like, yeah, he's just moving back down. Honestly, he's moving closer to home. It's really the only difference. Everything is the same. And now he's got an NFL offensive line that is more than capable in terms of compared to lines that he's previously dealt with at different levels. And he gets to learn from Kirk Cousins. So it's not people can. The whole question was, wow, why would you give Kirk $100 million and then pay Michael and then draft Michael Penix 8th overall? It's like, well, if Kirk leads them to like 2 playoff wins and maybe they make a run at the title game, and then for the next 10 plus years, Michael Penix is doing the same, I don't think anybody cares. Yeah. Is it a little bizarre to do it and make that approach? Sure. But when you do peel back we both are NFL nerds, the Atlanta Falcons PTSD of quarterback situations, I think that they're rather appropriate in making that crazy bet than saying, okay, we're going to bet on Michael Penix. This is our guy. And we're going to go bring in, the equivalent of, no offense, Jim Sorgi to be a veteran quarterback, bring him along, just coach him up, and Mike's going to be the guy. Sure. This is a win-win because you're banking on immediate success with Kirk now and long-term success with Mike. And you can already see if Mike's starting this year, they're fine. But if he has to start 2 years from now, so be it. It just means he has more time to build those relationships. And that's the one thing we saw at Washington, where give that man time. It doesn't take much for him to start connecting with receivers and weapons.
Absolutely. And so that's one of the things where I'm really glad you touched on all the points that you did, because we both completely understand why this pick was much maligned. We say this as people who've covered Mike for 2 years, have gotten to know him, have personal relationships with him on some level, but that doesn't mean that we're not aware of the Kirk Cousins factor, that we're not aware of all these other outside things that make it such a confusing pick with, just the money invested and all that sort of stuff. But at the same point, it all felt like it makes sense where you look at everything around him. And I know it's something we talked about on the show months ago, that this would be a great fit for him, that Atlanta has all the pieces necessary for Mike to succeed. And whether it happens this year, whether it happens next year, the year after, whenever it is. And that all certainly does play into it, where you don't want to draft a guy who's 24 years old and say, hey, we want to have him sit for multiple seasons. That's silly. You shouldn't have said that. But at the same point, if that's what it takes and that's what your plan is and it works, who are we to say that you're wrong? I feel like that's a really big part of this as well. But as you said, Lars, Mike has said all the right things. And we know that Kirk wasn't expecting the pick. That was one of the reasons he left Minnesota, because he didn't want to, have a rookie behind him just nipping at his heels. I'm sure there is part of him that isn't totally happy with the situation, but it sounds like the two have connected, the two have spoken. So it is what it is. And that's one of the reasons we want to make sure we discuss just this whole angle, was because we know that Mike is going to handle this with the utmost grace and professionalism and everything along that just along those lines. And at the same time, he's going to be lighting up on the practice field. And for anybody who's still doubting the pick, once you watch him throw, you will think otherwise. That is the one thing that I think, Lars, both you and I will stand by when it comes to Mike's success just going forward in the NFL, is once you watch him throw, you will be a believer. Like that's just kind of the end of the discussion.
Yeah, RG3, ironically enough, after I saw some videos of Mike with the Falcons, I was like, let me go back and do some research. You go back and look at all the people. RG3 said it best. After Caleb Williams, he was the number 2 quarterback in the draft in terms of quarterback, passer, thrower of the football. Now, does he have the athleticism? Does he have all the Caleb stuff, or even Jane Daniels or Drake May? Not necessarily, no. But again, he's also, who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. That's not what the quarterback does. Have to have the ability to be mobile on some level. But do you think Kirk Cousins is known as a dual threat quarterback? No. And the dude just got paid $100 million and is a consummate veteran quarterback in the NFL. So it doesn't, all that pre-draft stuff was so antagonizing, for lack of a better word, because we both know what the truth was, and yet we also both understand the other side of the agenda where, okay, yeah,
Sure.
theoretically you could point out X, Y, and Z. But when you get down to brass tacks, the Atlanta Falcons are in the best position possible because if anything, they now have a $100 million backup quarterback and the rookie who's balling out, or you have the rookie who, okay, maybe Mike needs to catch up to the playbook, or maybe has a couple of hiccups, whatever the case may be, right? Just takes a couple of extra time to get some connections down with certain receivers or certain routes or whatever the rationale may be, then you still have that veteran in place. But I think it's pretty clear. My favorite throw that I saw of Mike with his rookie minicamp with the Falcons was that one. I don't know if it was like a GA, but a rookie, but whoever it was, he threw the ball and just dropped it. I'm like, yeah, Mike does bring him in.
Dime.
But it was a dime. But in my head, I'm like, here's the thing that people don't appreciate about that. That ball come running with some zip. Like that was the one. So I'm like, I can't fault him for dropping it because you and I both probably would have dropped it. Let's be real.
So I'm glad you mentioned that because that was the one thing where that was clearly the first pass that I think his number was 19 that he had caught from Mike where he was, I didn't know it had that kind of zip on it. No, you're absolutely right. Lars, with that being said, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the everydayers tuning in. We really do appreciate your constant support now that we're truly in just the offseason mode. We've got so much more recruiting stuff coming up for you, so much more other fun stuff. So make sure you stay tuned and subscribe wherever you get your podcast, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So please make sure you hit that like button, click that little bell so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, show ideas, anything like that, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you're audio only, please give us a 5-star review as it all really does help the show. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you on Tuesday.